all schools to be open full-time, in person for all students, we really need to make sure students have an opportunity to learn in the classroom. And quite frankly, I'd rather have it this spring. Students don't learn as well remotely. There is no substitute for in-person learning. And I'm pleased, as you mentioned, we have 54% of our pre-K through 8 schools in full-time every day. About 90% are offering in-person learning for students. But until we're at 100%, we must keep our foot on the gas pedal.
Yeah, I better give a shout out to my teacher that I appreciate, Kay Corteliu, in high school at the Madeira School. I think I took Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 twice, and she sat with me for hours and hours alone, trying to make it happen. I think I barely got through, thanks to her, in all my classes. But I'm hearing about colleges. I mean, there are still graduate programs. They're still remote. I mean, this is going to be several years, maybe a generation of students, or at least, a 4-year span that is interrupted terribly by this pandemic. Not blaming the administration, but should we be back in school now before we see the long-term ramifications on these kids right now?
Absolutely. We should be in school if it's safe to get into schools. What we're doing right now is monitoring it more closely. We have data systems that we set up, and we're really reaching out to make sure that in places where they're not offering in-person learning or full-time in-person learning, we want to make sure that we're supporting those states, those districts, to find out why they're not. We have a clearinghouse that we released last week of hundreds of examples of where it's working and what strategies you can use. We really need to make sure we keep that level of urgency. Our kids can't wait. And the same is true for colleges. And while I expect blended learning or some form of remote learning to be a part of the new landscape of education, it doesn't substitute in-person learning. So that's why, we're really pushing hard to make sure that all students have an opportunity to get back into the classroom as soon as possible this spring.
Mr. Secretary, it's Willie Geist. Thanks for being on with us this morning. By some measures, 3 million students have lost touch with their schools since the pandemic began last year, meaning they haven't checked in for remote learning. Sometimes the school don't even know where these students are. Obviously, that has huge implications for those kids, for those schools, for their futures. What do you do about those students? Because, yes, it's been hard on many people, but when you think about 3 million young kids who haven't even been to school in almost a year and a half now, what do you do about that?
Sure. So, when I was a commissioner of education in Connecticut, we realized that many of our students who were experiencing the trauma of the pandemic had to move. Their families had to relocate to a different part of the country for various reasons. So, yes, we have to make sure that we're using the American Rescue Plan funds to make sure we're doing more to do outreach, to get folks out into the community, to reconnect those students and provide them not only that academic support that they're going to need, but that social emotional embrace that we know our students need to be successful. The American Rescue Plan does provide unprecedented funds for schools to think outside of the box, to reconnect with our families, working with outside agencies. The American Family Plan proposes community school funds so that we can make sure we're connecting our students into the classroom and our families back into the classrooms where they belong.
So, Mr. Secretary, when you look at the state of our schools in New York City, for example, they have been, since the pandemic began, among the safest places in this entire city. We know that transmission is lower with kids. We know they do better if they do get the disease. We know that they need to be in school. You've said all of that. As you look back on it now, has this country been too slow to reopen the schools? And is there any defense now for not having all the schools open?
One of the things that I learned from my experience is that one size does not fit all. So I went on a Help Is Here tour, and I visited about 9 states, about 10 different schools. And what I noticed was the differences in why folks weren't coming back in. In some places, we had buildings that were 130 years old. The ventilation system hasn't been touched in years, so they needed work there. In other places, there was hesitancy from families because of the trauma they experienced. But I do see that in many places across the country, school has been in session since August. My children have been in school since August. So there are examples where it's working. In those places where they're sputtering along, I want to make sure that this agency that I'm a part of is there on the ground with them, supporting them, but pushing. Our students need us more than ever now. We need to be in the classroom.
Knowing all the impacts, though, of having the schools closed, and knowing what we know now, that the disease isn't transmitted on surfaces, we don't have to go through all this deep cleaning that we thought we did at the beginning. We've learned a lot. Do you think the schools should have been open earlier?
You know, without looking at the context, it's difficult to answer that. You know, we do rely very heavily on CDC guidance. It's critically important that we're listening to our health experts because this is a health pandemic. In many cases, as we learn new information, plans change. And I've seen school systems change plans mid-course based on new data. I'm pleased to see that those districts that were able to bring students in also did it in a way that's safe. You know, you don't ever want to skip the mitigation strategies, but I do want to make districts who are nearing the end of the year are not taking their foot off the gas pedal. Do everything you can to get students in now because that emotional connection that our students need is critically important now. Think about summer learning experiences. Think about how the fall looks better and different. I do want to make sure that our folks are still trying to get our students in this year.
Mr. Secretary, I'd like you to discuss a specific group of students, and I know you're familiar with them from your history in Connecticut. And this would be K through 8 students, young people, obviously, who have basically missed 2 years of education, a year and a half at least of socialization, school socialization. These children come from homes where their parents can't afford tutors, where there perhaps is no laptop or iPad or broadband internet ready to roll for them. What specifically can be done to help these students who have already lost so much in terms of making sure that they don't lose even more?
Yeah. You know, that's going to be our work moving forward. I feel like the pandemic really, as I said before, sharpened our sword for the real fight ahead, which is addressing inequities that were exacerbated by this pandemic. We need to make sure that we never lose that sense of urgency for the next several years, provide social emotional support for those students, make sure the class sizes for those students are much smaller, make sure we're doing wraparound services for those students. You know, I spoke to a 6th grader recently who told me, when I came back to school, I found it difficult to socialize again because I was in front of my computer for a good part of a year. We need to make sure that our schools are prepared to provide that social emotional support, that interaction that our students have longed for. And when they come back, we have to realize this is not just about turning on the lights, providing face masks. This is really about making sure we're providing mental health support. A lot of these students face trauma in their lives. So we have to be prepared to work with that, but also the academic needs. I expect summer learning opportunities for students to be hands-on, outdoors, engaging with one another, like a camp almost. We really need to double down for our students. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to hit the reset button on things we know didn't work and really give our students the attention that they deserve. The American Rescue Plan provides the funds for it, so we need to step up for them.
Education Secretary Miguel Cardona, thank you very much for being on the show this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.